Here's something to think about. The two Gospels which were first influential in the history of the church, Matthew and John, are also the ones which are the most responsible for Christian attitudes toward the Jews. It is in John that Jesus accused the Jews of having the devil for their father, and it is in Matthew that we find the sevenfold condemnation of the scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites as if they were all the same. Whoever would be a disciple today must come to terms with these elements of the Gospels. Dr. Leander Keck, Dean of Biblical Theology, Yale Divinity School, will help us begin to understand why these elements are there. Once we begin to do that, we can begin to deal with them and their influence in the Christian church.
Why does Matthew's Jesus say such harsh things about the Jewish leadership? To answer this question, we need some historical information about the followers of Jesus who were Jews and the synagogue after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. Before that, the Jesus people were one of many groups of Jews in Palestine: Pharisees, Sadducees, monastics at the Dead Sea who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, revolutionary zealots, and various groups of Jewish Christians. Although there were tensions and rivalries between them, they somehow got along together. But after the revolt, which ended in the disaster of 70, the Sadducees disappeared, as did the monastics at Qumran and the revolutionary zealots. That left the Pharisees and the Jewish Christians. But now, those who had been leaders of the Pharisees became the rabbis, and they undertook to reshape Judaism, to consolidate it in the synagogues. Jewish Christians faced a different kind of Judaism, one that was increasingly self-conscious, deliberately defining itself over against everyone else. In such a situation, the Jewish Christians emphasized Jesus' own tensions with the Pharisees and appealed to the sayings and stories of Jesus in which these were expressed in order to find their own identity over against the synagogues. In other words, the Christians remembered Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees and overlooked all the things they had in common. So Matthew reflects the fact that the church's tension with the synagogue was stronger than the tension had been between the Pharisees and Jesus. And Matthew seems to think that the destruction of Jerusalem was God's punishment for the fate of the Jews. What can we know about Jesus' own conflicts with the Pharisees? It's difficult to answer the question because nothing was written down at the time. Everything we know about Jesus has been filtered through the needs of the later church. But exactly the same thing is true of the Jewish material. All the memories and traditions of the Pharisees of Jesus' day were filtered through the needs of the rabbis as they consolidated their influence. So it's not easy to get a balanced picture of the Judaism Jesus himself confronted. A few things are fairly clear, however. Both Jesus and the Pharisees believed that God's will was spelled out in the Torah, the law, especially in the Pentateuch. But three things characterized the Pharisees. One was the passion to make the entire people of Israel obedient to the law, even if this meant applying to everyone laws which pertained only to the priests. Did not the law say that the people were to be a kingdom of priests for God? The second was that the Pharisees knew very well that the ancient laws had to be applied to new situations, and that the only way one could really obey the law is to know exactly what it did and did not require. What does it mean to do no work on the Sabbath? To answer this, you have to know what is work. Is it work to start a fire? To feed a cow? And when does the Sabbath begin? And when does it end? In other words, the Pharisees became legal scholars because they had to. A modern example will help. Think of the IRS regulations about your income tax. Someone has to define income, to say who is a dependent, and at what point one is no longer a dependent. Whoever wants to do God's will as specified in the law becomes a legalist. That's why there are Christian legalists too. Maybe you know some of them. The final feature about the Pharisees was that they regarded these detailed rulings about the law as part of the law itself and not as an appendix. For them, the law had two forms, the written and the oral. What was written in the book of Moses and the inferences and rulings that were handed on from the teachers of the text. Just as today, lawyers quote case after case and ruling after ruling, so the Pharisees quoted earlier teachings in order to show that their interpretations were correct. So, what was the problem between Jesus and the Pharisees? Two things separated them. One was Jesus' perception that the legal mind is often satisfied with knowing whether a law has or has not been violated, rather than asking whether an act is right or just. He had no patience with the person who defended his action by saying, "It's all perfectly legal." This is why Jesus says that you don't have to commit adultery in order to be guilty of adultery. The opposite is just as true. You can keep the Sabbath, fulfill its purpose, even if technically you violate a regulation about it. The Pharisees knew quite well that whoever thinks and acts this way makes their whole program impossible, because one is always going behind the law to God's will. The other thing grows right out of this. Jesus acted as if he knew what God's will is. From the Pharisees' angle, he acts as if he had a hot line to God. No wonder Matthew reports that they asked him point blank, "Who gave you this authority?" The readers of Matthew know, of course, what the Pharisees do not know, but are invited to believe, that it was God who authorized Jesus.
So Jesus did not come to save us from the law, but to save us from our using the law to insulate ourselves from God's will. According to Jesus, as for Paul, the law is not the problem. We are the problem.